I know it hurts in ways people will never see. You smile on the outside, but every night you fall apart in silence. You keep pretending you're fine because you're afraid no one would understand. Or worse, they'd think you're dramatic. You don't want pity. You just want someone who truly listens. Someone who doesn't tell you to move on when your heart is still bleeding. When he first arrived, imagine you are watching a movie in slow motion, but the movie is your real life, and you do not know how it will end. That was exactly how I felt when my daughter walked into the living room with the man she said she wanted to spend the rest of her life with. My brain tried to smile, my heart tried to understand, and my future suddenly felt like a puzzle I did not remember learning how to solve. His handshake was warm, confident, polite, and sincere, but my thoughts were loud enough to drown every word he said. It felt like my emotions were speaking a secret language that even I could not translate. When I looked at him, I did not just see a person. I saw a decision, a doorway, a new chapter, and a silent exam that nobody prepared me for. People think parents judge their child's partner based on money, looks, career, or background, but that is not always true. Sometimes what we fear is not who they are, but who we were when we made the same choice. It is almost like your mind becomes a time machine and suddenly forces you to rewatch scenes you never planned to repeat. The promises you broke, the words you never said, and the dreams you left outside your marriage like an unwatered plant that slowly forgot how to grow. Psychologists say that humans make emotional conclusions long before logical evaluations. Your brain scans for threat, not perfection. Tries to protect you even if you have no idea what you are protecting. That is why when he arrived, my first reaction was not joy or excitement, but a quiet internal alert. Do not trust too quickly. Pain has good memory. And the strange part is he did nothing wrong. He was kind, respectful, calm, and honest. But love stories are not judged only by what we see, but by what we once survived. That I watched how he held her hand, gently, calmly, without trying to show off or perform. I watched how my daughter looked at him, not like someone who was searching, but like someone who finally found a place to breathe. And I felt something confusing, a mix of fear, pride, and disbelief. Because when a parent sees their child choose love, they are not only watching a beginning, they are also witnessing the moment their own influence ends and another person's influence begins. In that very moment, I realized the scariest part of marriage is not losing your child, but losing the version of yourself you thought was enough. Father's secret fears. Have you ever looked at someone you love more than life itself and felt your heart tighten? Not with joy, but with fear? That's how I felt the first time I really considered the man my daughter married. On the surface, he was polite, charming, respectful, even thoughtful. He smiled in the right places, spoke in the right tone, and treated my daughter like a treasure. But inside me, a storm raged that nobody could see. It was the storm of what-ifs, maybes, and the quiet whispers of a father who has survived life's betrayals and scars. That I feared not for her happiness in abstract terms, but in very real, painfully detailed scenarios. What if he couldn't handle disagreements without resentment? What if the pressures of life revealed flaws she hadn't noticed? What if she, in her trust and innocence, was walking blindly into heartbreak? My mind traced every possibility like a forensic investigator of grief yet to come, and the images were not pretty. I saw arguments in the kitchen, tears shed in the bedroom, silent dinners where words could not fix what had been broken. I could almost feel the weight of each unspoken disappointment pressing on her shoulders, and in that moment, I understood the terrifying responsibility of letting go. Psychologists call this anticipatory anxiety. The mind rehearses future pain as a way to prepare, but often it just traps you in a loop of helplessness. Every father, every parent, experiences this in some form when their children take steps into independence. It's a paradox. You want them free, yet you fear the world will hurt them more than you can protect. My chest tightened each time I imagined his imperfections clashing with her dreams. And what made it worse was realizing that some fears are not logical. They are emotional echoes of your own past mistakes, the moments when you were vulnerable, naive, or overlooked. Yet, in the midst of this fear, there was an unexpected lesson. I began to notice how small acts revealed character. How he carefully listened when she spoke, how he remembered tiny details about her day, how he carried a quiet patience that contrasted sharply with my worst imaginings. It reminded me of a principle from behavioral psychology. Actions reveal intentions more clearly than words. Observing these small details softened my rigid, fearful heart, but it did not erase the pain of relinquishing control. The fear lingered like a shadow at the edge of my vision, reminding me that love and worry are inseparable companions for a parent. And so I sat in that room watching them together, feeling proud and terrified all at once. My secret fears were not failures. They were proof of love, evidence that I had invested deeply in someone else's life. But that knowledge did not make the ache lighter. It only made it more human. Because being a parent means carrying invisible burdens, worrying in silence, and sometimes letting your child step into the unknown while your heart screams inside. Silent social isolation. There is a strange kind of pain that creeps in when you feel invisible in your own life. After the wedding, I began noticing it. The quiet emptiness in rooms where laughter used to fill the air. The sudden absence of familiar conversations. The way dinner felt colder when only my thoughts were the company I could trust. It's not loneliness in the traditional sense. It's more subtle, more insidious. It's the kind that whispers to you, saying you are no longer central in the life you helped build. And when you realize this, fear and guilt become tangled together, like thorns wrapped around your heart. I started avoiding social situations, not out of arrogance, but because every interaction reminded me of the distance that had grown. Friends would casually ask, "How is your daughter?" And the question would pierce through me, a reminder of all the moments I could not control. I found myself withdrawing, speaking less, fearing that my words would reveal the ache I could not hide. In those moments, the silence was deafening, louder than any argument or harsh word could ever be. Science explains that humans experience social pain in a way very similar to physical pain. The brain activates the same regions. It's why isolation can feel like a literal ache inside your chest, a heaviness that no distraction can fully lift. I remember one evening, sitting alone on the balcony, watching the city lights of Denmark flicker in the fog. My daughter and her husband had gone to visit friends, and I was left with nothing but my own thoughts. I tried to distract myself, reading, listening to music, even walking aimlessly, but the quiet kept returning. The mind tends to replay fears when it is idle, and mine painted images of her struggling silently, of mistakes I feared she would make, and of my own failures echoing back to me. The pain was compounded by knowing that, in a way, I had to let her navigate these trials without interference. Every instinct screamed to protect her, yet every rational thought knew that overprotection could suffocate, not save. And yet, this isolation was not entirely barren. It forced reflection. I noticed small patterns in my own reactions, the old habits of control and anxiety that had colored my parenting. I realized that in withdrawing I was also learning a quiet form of patience, a way to sit with discomfort without acting impulsively. It was painful, yes, but it was teaching me something vital. That love sometimes requires absence, silence, and the courage to watch life unfold without interference. Still, the ache remained, an enduring reminder that parenthood, like any deep connection, is a mixture of joy and a piercing silent grief that never fully disappears. Science behind lost passion. Have you ever wondered why something you once loved so deeply can suddenly feel distant, like a memory covered in fog? That's exactly how I felt about life, and even my own passions after watching my daughter step into marriage. Psychologists call this phenomenon emotional fading, a process where repetitive stress, fear, or overwhelming responsibility gradually erode the drive that once burned brightly inside us. It is not weakness. It is biology. Your brain protects you from potential pain by dimming the intensity of attachment to things that could hurt you. In my case, every worry about her future, every replay of potential what-if scenarios, made me unconsciously suppress hope and excitement, the very emotions that fuel passion. Neuroscience explains it further. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thinking and planning, often overrides the limbic system, the seat of emotion, when stress is prolonged. In simpler terms, your brain says, "We must survive first. Passion can wait." So while my heart wanted to feel proud and joyful, my mind kept scanning for threats, risks, and mistakes. That constant hyper-awareness acted like a dimmer switch on the fire I used to carry. My enthusiasm, my curiosity, even the energy to engage fully with life. Suddenly, every day became a series of calculated moves, not moments to savor. Behavioral psychology adds another layer. Humans are wired to mirror the emotional tone of those around them. Watching my daughter navigate a world of commitment, compromise, and challenges, while I silently feared every misstep, created a feedback loop in my own emotions. Anxiety amplified my vigilance, and vigilance blunted joy. Essentially, my nervous system became a guardian, tirelessly alert, but at the expense of emotional freedom. This is why parents often feel exhausted after milestones that should feel celebratory. They are unconsciously carrying the emotional weight of both past experiences and imagined futures. But there is a light in understanding this mechanism. Recognizing that passion can fade due to stress or fear, rather than a lack of love or effort, is liberating. It allows us to approach ourselves with compassion instead of guilt. I began to see that the numbness I felt toward my own hobbies, my own daily pleasures, was not a personal failing. It was my brain's way of coping with an emotional storm too large to bear all at once. I learned to observe the fading flame, to respect it, and to gently rekindle it step by step, rather than demanding it roar back instantly. And so, knowing the science behind why passion ebbs helped me make peace with my own vulnerability. I realized that loss of motivation or dimmed excitement does not signify defeat. It signals a need for patience, awareness, and small acts that reignite life's fire. Sometimes the brain dims the light not to punish, but to protect, leaving you with a quiet ache that reminds you. Survival and love are intertwined, and that ache is proof that you have truly lived and deeply cared. A small turning moment. It happened on a rainy afternoon. I was sitting in the living room, staring blankly at a cup of coffee that had gone cold, when my daughter's husband walked in and did something so ordinary it shook me to my core. He noticed a small stack of papers I had been struggling with for days. Bills, schedules, reminders, and without fanfare he quietly organized them. There was no announcement, no expectation of gratitude, just a simple gesture of attentiveness. And in that tiny act, I felt a crack in the wall I had built around my heart. It's strange how the smallest things can awaken the buried parts of yourself. Psychologists call this microaffirmation, a subtle action that validates another person's existence or efforts. It's often overlooked, but its impact is profound. In that moment, my fear, my anxiety, my silent sorrow all began to soften. I realized I had been so focused on protecting my daughter from every imaginable hurt that I had stopped noticing the goodness that was already present. His actions, humble and consistent, became evidence that the world wasn't entirely a place for fear. That I began observing more. How he laughed with her, not at her. How he listened without interrupting. How he treated the smallest promises as sacred. Each observation chipped away at the rigid barriers I had built. It reminded me of a psychological principle. Our brains are wired to notice threat more readily than kindness, because survival historically depended on detecting danger. But when kindness is repeated, persistent, it rewires your neural pathways. Slowly, the part of me that had been dulled by worry started to awaken. Emotionally, this moment was more than just relief, it was revelation. I realized that my silent fears had been overshadowing reality. I had been so immersed in what could go wrong that I failed to see what is already right. And there's a lesson here for anyone who has felt paralyzed by fear, grief, or loss. Sometimes you don't need a grand gesture or a miracle to change your perspective. A simple, mindful act of goodness is enough to stir hope, enough to remind you that life can surprise you with warmth, even when your heart has been aching for years. That afternoon, I allowed myself to breathe differently. The ache in my chest was still there, but it no longer felt like a warning. It felt like a signal that I was alive, capable of noticing beauty again. I began to understand that small turning points, those almost invisible moments, can shift your entire perception, making the impossible seem possible. And in that realization, I glimpsed the beginning of healing. That the fear, the grief, and the quiet isolation were not the end of the story. They were the prelude to something new, something tender, and something profoundly human. Learning to love again. It was not immediate. Healing, I learned, is rarely sudden. After that small turning moment, I realized I had been holding back love in subtle ways. Expecting perfection, measuring worth, guarding my heart against imagined pains. But now, observing the gentle rhythm of their interactions, I saw a lesson I had forgotten. Love is not about controlling outcomes, it is about presence. Being fully present, listening without judgment, and offering understanding even when it hurts. That is how love grows. Psychologists note that empathy is a skill that can atrophy if unused, much like a muscle. For years, I had been so preoccupied with fear and worry that my ability to feel empathy deeply had dulled. I noticed that I had judged situations before hearing the full story, had assumed intentions before observing actions, and had avoided vulnerable conversations to protect myself from disappointment. But witnessing my daughter and her husband navigate life together, patiently, respectfully, I was reminded that love is learned moment by moment. Through choice and attention, I began practicing small acts of intentional presence. Sitting beside them at dinner, I asked questions not to critique, but to understand. When disagreements arose, I resisted the urge to intervene immediately and instead listened, allowing space for feelings to be expressed. Each time I successfully paused my fear and judgment, I felt the walls around my heart soften. Science supports this. When we consciously cultivate empathy and active listening, oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone, increases, fostering emotional connection and reinforcing trust. My nervous system, previously tense with fear, began to relax, signaling that it was safe to feel and to love again. Emotionally, it was terrifying and exhilarating at once. I had spent decades guarding my heart from potential pain, and now I was intentionally opening it, knowing vulnerability could hurt. But I also saw the beauty in witnessing trust unfold. My daughter laughed more freely, her husband's patience shone brighter, and I could sense a harmony that had been missing from our family dynamic. It was not about controlling their marriage or correcting past mistakes. It was about participating fully in the present, with all its joys and imperfections. Through this process, I discovered something profound. Learning to love again is not only about rekindling connection with others, it is about reclaiming parts of yourself that fear had hidden. It is about daring to feel, daring to hope, and daring to participate in life even after wounds have left scars. And as I sat there watching their quiet interactions, I realized that love, when approached with patience, attention, and vulnerability, can heal even the deepest aches. Rebuilding family bonds. Reconnecting with family is not a one-time event. It's a slow, delicate process, like mending a torn tapestry thread by thread. After learning to open my heart again, I realized I needed to rebuild not just the relationship with my daughter, but with her husband and the wider family circle. The first step was humility. I had to admit quietly to myself that my fears had often made me distant, critical, or overprotective. This acknowledgement was painful. It stung to see how my anxiety had created walls where bridges could have stood. That I began intentionally reaching out. Small gestures mattered more than grand declarations. Sending a message to check how they were, asking about their day with genuine curiosity, offering help without expecting gratitude. Each act gradually softened the invisible tension that had built up over time. Behavioral science shows that consistent, positive interactions can gradually override negative perceptions. The brain forms new neural pathways when repeatedly exposed to empathy and kindness, even in situations previously marked by stress or conflict. In other words, small consistent efforts could slowly heal the scars my anxiety had left in our family dynamics. One evening, I invited them to cook together. It was a simple plan, meant to be practical and casual, yet it became profoundly symbolic. As we chopped vegetables, stirred sauces, and laughed at minor kitchen disasters, I realized the power of shared mindful moments. The laughter was authentic, not forced. It reminded me that family is built not just on words, but on experience, the quiet, repeated experiences that slowly knit hearts together. Even neuroscience supports this. Shared activities increase oxytocin levels, the bonding hormone, fostering trust and connection. Yet, the process was not without difficulty. Old fears returned at unexpected moments, judgments creeping in, silent doubts whispering, anxiety flaring when I misinterpreted a tone or a glance. But each time I noticed these patterns, I consciously reminded myself of the progress we had made. I learned to separate my emotional projections from reality, observing the present rather than reacting from past wounds. This self-awareness was key. It allowed me to respond with patience and love rather than fear, gradually rebuilding not just relationships, but my own emotional resilience. In the end, what I found is that rebuilding family bonds is as much about personal growth as it is about connection. It requires courage, attention, and persistence. And even in the lingering ache, there is beauty. The ache signals that you care deeply, that you are willing to be vulnerable, and that love is not a static state, but an ongoing practice. With each mindful action, each moment of listening, each shared smile, I felt the warmth returning, the quiet joy of being part of a living, breathing family again. Finding peace and moving forward. After months of quiet reflection, small gestures, and observing the subtle beauty of everyday life, I began to feel a sense of peace. A fragile, delicate peace, but peace nonetheless. Watching my daughter and her husband navigate life together, I realized that fear, no matter how persistent, does not have to dictate our experience. The anxiety that once consumed me slowly transformed into appreciation. I learned to celebrate the small victories, the acts of kindness, the laughter, and even the moments of tension, because all of them were part of life's intricate, unrepeatable tapestry. Psychology teaches us that acceptance does not mean resignation. It means acknowledging reality as it is while still holding space for hope. I had spent years clinging to control, imagining every worst-case scenario, and letting it sap the joy from my daily life. By letting go of the impossible need to control, I found freedom. I allowed myself to feel the full spectrum of emotion, from lingering sorrow to quiet pride, from subtle nostalgia to genuine hope. And in doing so, I discovered that life's passion never truly disappears. It only waits for you to notice it again. One day, as I sat on the porch watching the soft Danish sunlight filter through the trees, my daughter laughing in the garden, I realized that I had learned the most profound lesson. Love, patience, and vulnerability are intertwined. We cannot shield those we love from every hurt, nor can we protect ourselves from the emotional waves of life entirely. But we can choose to stay present, to act with empathy, and to nurture connection deliberately. That is where healing begins and where passion quietly rekindles. I also recognize that my personal passions, once dulled by worry and exhaustion, could be revived the same way. Step by step. Through small actions, mindful engagement, and the courage to allow myself to feel again. The ache, the silent fears, the occasional pangs of isolation, they were not signs of failure. They were proof that I cared deeply, that I had lived fully, and that I was still capable of growth and joy. In essence, every scar became a marker of resilience, every shadow a reminder that light can always return. So, if you are watching this and feeling the weight of fear, loss, or doubt, know this: your passion, your love, your spark is not gone. It may be dim, hidden beneath layers of pain, but it is still there. And sometimes the path to finding it again starts with the smallest observation, the quietest act of presence, the willingness to let go and let life unfold.